Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for this event. I'm really excited about this today. Movement lawyering for human rights attorneys, practical tips for working internationally. My name is Charity Ryerson. I'm the Executive Director at Corporate Accountability Lab. If you're not familiar with our organization, we do international supply chain work looking at human rights abuses by corporations and trying to figure out how we can hold them accountable in the global economy. I used to be a human rights attorney, human rights litigator myself, but because there are so few human rights laws available, we started looking more at how to use different areas of commercial law for accountability for corporations, because those areas of law tend to be more effective than human rights law in many cases. So why are we hosting this particular panel, you might be wondering? Well, this kind of emerged from a conversation amongst my staff. We were all talking about how the business and human rights world of which we are a part doesn't always reflect maybe some of the movement values that we see in a lot of other areas of public interest law. So I think that sometimes a lot of public defenders or civil rights attorneys and others will have more of a movement lawyering perspective, which we'll talk about today. And the business and human rights field can wind up being more prioritizing expertise, being very top down, sometimes reflecting international organizations like the UN and the ILO, where while we might have some similar outcomes that we're seeking to achieve with some of these organizations, there's a big difference in the process by which we may want to achieve those outcomes. And so in this conversation, we started to think we should talk more internally about movement lawyering and how we can make sure to incorporate those practices in our work. But then we thought, gosh, this is really potentially valuable information for a lot of people to hear more about and think more about in our field. So we put this together with two panelists here that I am so excited to introduce to you. Both of them have really extraordinary backgrounds. And I'm just gonna start by introducing Renee and Bill, and then we have questions. At the end, we're gonna do some Q&A time. If you could all just do me a favor, and instead of putting your questions in the chat, if you could put it in the Q&A. So feel free to use the chat, have conversation about our conversation as we go. But if you put your question in the Q&A, then I won't lose it. We'll really make sure to get to you by the end. So Renee Hatcher is an assistant professor of law and the director of the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic at UIC John Marshall Law School here in Chicago. Her work and research focus on solidarity economy theory and practice and law. Prior to joining UIC John Marshall Law School, she taught in the Community Development Clinic at the University of Baltimore School of Law and served a postdoctoral appointment at the University of Texas Austin's Institute for Urban Policy Research and Analysis. She has served as a staff attorney and project director for the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and she's on the board of the New Economy Coalition and is a member of the Law for Black Lives Clinic cohort development team. She received her law degree from NYU. I just met Renee pretty recently through a business and human rights space where folks are starting to think about the corporate form and more transformational change in this space. I heard her speak. I was so excited about it. And we were already sort of planning this event, and I just had to pull her in because she was so awesome. So I'm sure everyone's going to enjoy her comments today. Our other panelist is Bill Quigley. He is a law professor emeritus and former director of the Law Clinic and the Gillis Long Poverty Law Center at Loyola University, New Orleans. He's been an active public interest and human rights lawyer since 1977. Bill has served as counsel with a wide range of public interest organizations on issues including Katrina social justice issues, public housing, voting rights, death penalty, living wage, human rights, civil liberties, educational reform, constitutional rights, and civil disobedience. Bill has litigated numerous cases with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, the Advancement Project, and with the ACLU of Louisiana, where he was general counsel for over 15 years. He's been an active lawyer with School of the Americas Watch and the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. Bill served as legal director of the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York from 2009 to 2011 before coming back to Loyola. Now I know Bill because, gosh, how long? In 2002, I got arrested at the School of the Americas and Bill was my lawyer. And I will say that it is not his fault that I served 6 months in federal prison as a result, but I did. And Bill was part of the School of the Americas Watch Legal Collective. And so we go way back. I'm very familiar with Bill's movement lawyering work going back quite a bit. So we're so excited to have you both today. I'm going to start off with some questions. And what I really want is for this just to be more of a conversation. I know we have, this is kind of in a panel format and there's a lot of people watching, but we three know each other and I'm really excited to have this conversation. So if you hear something from one of your co-panelists and you want to bounce off of that, just feel free to jump in. So maybe to give us a base, I think a lot of folks who are here today don't actually know what movement lawyering is. So maybe let's start with Bill. Just tell us a little bit about what is movement lawyering and how is it different from just traditional lawyering?
So thank you, Charity and Professor Hatcher. It's great to be on this Zoom with you and all the 50-something people that are on it. That's really exciting. I wish I had something like this, available to me when I was trying to figure out how to become a lawyer. And it's, I would start with a caution that nobody can teach anybody about movement lawyering. It's not that. Is that we all can learn, and we can continue to learn, and we can learn how to do it better. But it really is something that you have to love, you want to do, and you figure out how to do it and how it makes sense in the context that you're in. As you said, I think it is, you have, for those on the call that are international human rights lawyers and that is an extra challenge, that not being physically proximate to the people that you're working with on an ongoing basis. There's an extra challenge for those of us who are white, who are not from the communities that we're serving, or if you're not in that thing. We have lots of challenges for all of us. What I would say is, in terms of definition of movement lawyer, I came to it, we never called it movement lawyering until a few years ago, so it's a great name. I came to it as I started out as a legal services lawyer and did a bunch of work, great civil rights work and housing work and the like. And I found that, what was the most satisfying work and most meaningful work was when I was working with organizations of people, some sort of community. They could be anything from a handful to a couple of dozen, it's rarely more than that. Sometimes in terms of public housing work, it might be, several dozen people that we're working on. But, and then I was fortunate enough to be working with a paralegal whose name was Ron Chisholm. And Ron helped start the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond that has taught anti-racism workshops for over 1 million people. At the time, he hadn't done that yet. He had been a public housing organizer. And he really, we worked together on a lot of things, and he would very gently but very quietly say, well, Bill, what do you think of this is actually working, and what do you think is not working, and what do you think the challenges are, and the like. And so that's how I got involved. I called it social justice lawyer and called it, all kinds of things. But I would say movement lawyering is one of the categories of work that a lot of us who have good hearts and good minds do. One kind that we're familiar with is impact litigation, right? Where you come up with a good theory and you try to find the baddest guy to sue, and you do a lot of research, you get a lot of people, you spend a lot of time on it, and maybe you're lucky, survive a motion to dismiss, maybe you get into something, maybe you can settle, you can do something. That's very important work. All of us who do justice work do individual representation. We might help somebody stop an eviction, or help somebody whose cars got ripped off, or that sort of stuff. We do that. That's part of it. Movement lawyering is really working with communities of people, and that's the key. I think if there's nothing else, it's communities of people who are fighting for a fair share of the power that should be in their lives. So it is not really about winning and losing cases quite so much as it is about, can the lawyer be in a respectful partnership, and a respectful partnership like the partnerships that we have in our lives with our families and the people that we work with, and that to be in a respectful partnership with directly impacted communities who are organizing to bring about change. And what that means for all of us, I think, is that at least some of our work should be in a direct relationship with directly impacted communities. And from your personal relationships, and I know from my personal relationships, that there's yin and yang, and things work and things don't work, and there's miscommunications, and there's great communications, and there's love, and there's fighting, and there's jealousy, and there's all kinds of things. And that's the life of being involved with people. And this is really people work. And so the 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 role can be very different. And I came out of law school and I had skipped corporate law and tax and a bunch of other stuff. And I got out and I found, I had community organizations that I was working with trying to get a fair share of federal funds. And so we'd have rallies, they'd have protests, we'd file an administrative complaint, we'd file a lawsuit and then they'd say, Bill, we need to incorporate and we want to get a 501c3 and that sort of stuff. And I'm like, well, I skipped that. I thought that was somebody else. I thought that was for regular lawyers. And I'm like, a justice lawyer, and I don't need any of that. Well, it turns out the people we work with need all those things. And so one of the things that I think that is a key part of movement lawyering is that we're in a partnership. So I had to give this talk in Port-au-Prince. I've been to Port-au-Prince 2 or 3 dozen times over the years. And one day I showed up there at a law firm that I did some work with, and they said, Bill, we have this group of women who are all active in justice work, and we want you to talk about movement lawyering and social justice lawyering and social change lawyering and all that. And I didn't speak Creole and they didn't speak English. So but they were there, they were sitting there. And so I was just thrown into it. So one of the things I figured out is the hand, is that in terms of social justice work and social change, if you study it, which is part of the job that we all have to do, we have to continually study these movements that have been successful and the ones that haven't been successful. But every movement that I've seen has several fingers on the hand. You have somebody who's doing research and that sort of work to try and find out the basics of what's going on. You have people who are organizing, who are bringing the communities together, who are talking, going door to door, doing petitions, listening to people, showing up, going to meetings at night, that sort of stuff. You have people that are going to work in the legislative or adjudicative or litigation, or, there's always some sort of legislative or legal dimension to it as well. There's a media dimension to it, and there's a direct action dimension to it. Plus, there's other things as well, but all of those things are part of it. So the role of the lawyer, I got out, I was pretty convinced that the role of the lawyer were 2 things. One, to be a voice for the voiceless. And second, that it was going to be federal civil rights litigation. That's what I really worked on. Well, as my friend Ron Chisholm patiently explained to me as we did this work, he said, Bill, you see, there's really not any voiceless people out here. There's people whose voices we don't listen to, or they get shouted down. The job of the lawyer is to, can you find a way to shut everybody up so that we can let people talk about their own lives and their own stories and that. We'd like to have you talk about it, but it'd be better for you to help create some space so people can actually tell their own stories. And the second thing was that although I was very interested in federal civil rights litigation, took all those courses in that, not everybody wanted that. And in many cases, that was the last thing they wanted. They wanted to figure out how to do a nonprofit corporation or a 501c3, or figure out how to get public records or lots of other things, and learn that the role of a lawyer in a movement lawyering capacity is not to be a hammer or a knife or a screwdriver, but is to be a Swiss Army knife, to be whatever the people that we're working with need. And so that if they need to figure out how to do a press release, then if you don't know how to do it, then you help them find somebody who can. And then they learn. And that you don't go in front of the city council to talk on their behalf, that maybe you go there and you're one part of 5 people who talk, and you do the legal part, but you make sure that everybody else has a chance to tell their story and help them figure out how to demystify it and go to some meetings beforehand and that sort of stuff. And so it's not issue lawyering, it is community lawyering, and it's about power. And it's, litigation is very helpful, but there's plenty of other things as well. And then later I'll talk a little bit about some of the specific challenges in international human rights as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill. That was a great way to kick us off. And also transitions really nicely to Renee. So Renee, you have been thinking a lot about the solidarity economy lawyering, which from reading your article, which we posted a link to Renee's article and a couple of Bill's in the chat here, and we'll repost those at the end. But Renee has this great article on solidarity economy lawyering, and it seems like a really interesting example of movement lawyering. So Renee, can you tell us a little bit more about what is a solidarity economy, what is solidarity economy lawyering, and to what extent does that reflect some of the principles that Bill was just laying out?
Sure, great. And I'm so glad to be here, in part because this is a really wonderful opportunity to be in conversation with both of you, but also to think about movement lawyering across practice areas. And as Bill said, just picking up on this idea of how do we, those of us who aspire to be movement lawyers, think of ourselves as Swiss Army knives, or be responsive and adaptive to the things that communities need, like the actual people that we're working with and in community with. So I feel like this is a really unique opportunity to talk about across practice areas and how we incorporate different tools that might be in the legal toolbox to actually be more effective in supporting movement. So solidarity economy, that's in large part has been my focus, but part of it too is really just coming from different practice areas. Like, as Bill said, I too took the route of thinking about impact litigation, thinking about civil rights litigation, and started my career doing some of that. And from the experience of both doing and reflecting, got not just frustrated, but also just very clear about the limitations of the actual legal system, and made a shift to work more so in community, doing community lawyering, however that kind of evolved. And so a lot of my work is working with small businesses, community-based businesses, nonprofit organizations, grassroots community associations, and trying to really enact the vision that they have for their own neighborhoods and communities. So in doing some of that, I wanted to be very clear about what my theory of change was, how that I incorporated that theory of change into my practice, and not just thinking about it as direct service, but thinking about it overall as structural and transformative change. And that is the way in which I became a part of the solidarity economy movement, which essentially is just a movement and a theory to transform the dominant capitalist economy to one that puts the needs of people and the sustainability of the planet at its core, right? And through a process of building institutions that are really based on economic democracy, based on participatory democracy in different ways, building out a economy that embeds the values that so many of our movements, right, that are at the core of so many of our movements, things like racial justice, things like economic justice and economic rights, right, and it ties very very explicitly to what we think of as the core of social and economic rights in terms of the solidarity economy. And so the solidarity economy, again, just as a summary, it is simply a movement to put the needs of people and the planet at the core of the economy. And it seeks to actively dismantle capitalism and replace it with the solidarity economy. And so I do that work by supporting solidarity economy initiatives and experiments. That can be things like worker cooperatives, but also time bank institutions, different types of community associations that are really fundamentally trying to bring about transformative change. And so the lawyering piece of this is, again, doing some of that direct service work, but it's also thinking about law reform around just coming up with other types of entities, thinking about how do we reimagine transactional law, or the principles that actually undergird business transactions when people are motivated by different principles than the maximization of profit or the exploitation of workers. How do we think about both structuring relationships as well as institutions that really provide what people and communities need? And so there's the advocacy piece certainly to a lot of this. It certainly ties in with different types of human rights work. Some of the work that I've done is around like the right to water, and thinking about different ways in which communities and local communities can address issues of displacement and gentrification and have a say in the economic development process that we know causes all kinds of environmental harm. And so broadly speaking, there's a lot really packed into solidarity economy. And in a way, it's a way for me to think about, how do I check my work? How do I think about the clients that I prioritize and decide to take on in my clinic and in my pro bono work. But also it's a blueprint in terms of how do we fundamentally transform this society and this economy to one that gets us a little bit closer to justice. So it's a process.
Great,
So
thank you.
I'll stop there, but I'm happy to follow up or go deeper in any of this.
I have a lot of follow-up questions, but I'm going to stop myself because we have a lot that we want to cover. I know we need to get to this kind of international focus, and I want to get there, but maybe before we do, briefly, I wonder if each of you could just give us some examples of where folks are working in the public interest. So they're working in whatever sort of public interest law field, and what might be examples of good movement lawyering and bad movement lawyering, or just something that might seem like movement lawyering but isn't. I think that for some of us, getting into some examples might be helpful to like focus our minds on how those principles work. I know, Renee, in your article, you gave an example of a catering business and kind of different models. And I think, Bill, you have also given some examples in some of your articles. I wonder if either of you could tease those out to help us understand this in practice a little better. Bill, do you want to go first?
So I'll give you a bad one, which is a friend of mine. She was asked by a group to, a neighborhood organization had come together because they had a railroad crossing that was very dangerous in their neighborhood. It wasn't protected, that sort of stuff. And so she knew one of the people in the group, and they invited her to come to a meeting. They had 100 people there. They were all fired up. They wanted to file suit. So she, did the research, that sort of stuff, took a couple of people in as plaintiffs, started the thing, filed suit. They held a big press conference outside the courthouse. 50 people showed up to support the thing. They had a couple of various hearings in court, and they'd have 30 or 40 people show up, and but it dragged on. And as it dragged on, it's like 15 people showed up, and ultimately, they just on the eve of trial, the city and the railroad and all these other people said, look, we understand, we will do it. And so they held a big victory party for doing this, and 10 people showed up to the victory party. And because the litigation had gone on so long and people had just been unconnected, and they had never developed a strategy to keep people participating. So the victory ended up being the victory of the lawyers and a couple of plaintiffs. Whereas at the beginning, they had 100 people, and at the end, they had less than 10% of that. And so that, in many ways of looking at things, we would say is a victory. In law school, we would say that was a victory because, they won the outcome. Well, but did they gain power? Did they gain personal satisfaction and accomplishment and all that by doing this? And they didn't. And the lawyer realized afterwards, she is, she's not a lawyer anymore, for one thing, but, realized that actually the process of advocating disempowered the community. And so it was a textbook of what we think the lawyering is about, but it's actually a disaster. Flip side of that is I'm sitting in this room right now in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which is our state capital. And 5 years ago, I filed a suit on behalf of formerly incarcerated people, 80,000 people in Louisiana, to be able to get the right to vote. And there was a group called Voice of the Experienced. And you can see some of their things behind. I'm in their conference room right now because I just came from a meeting with the governor where he signed several bills making it easier for people to vote, to be on jury service, to be able to clear up their records, all this other stuff, put tens of thousands of people back on the rolls. They started at the beginning. They said, Bill, we want to file a suit, but we also want to do legislation. We want to fight this in the legislature, and we want to use the suit to help us get information from the state that we can use in the legislature with the Black Caucus. And then we want to also have a social and educational system. So today we started this thing in a meeting with about a dozen people, and most of the lawyers there said, well, you can't win this suit. There isn't, the Voting Rights Act doesn't do this and that. And they said, well, Bill, we we realize we may not win the suit, but we can use the suit as an opportunity to bring people together, to educate, get information. And so today at this thing with the governor, there was maybe 60 people who came from all over the state on less than 24 hours notice that the bill was going to be signed. And so they did with a variety of strategies, fundraising, organizing, outreach. They established chapters in various places, and then the litigation was important. We absolutely lost the litigation. We lost in the district court, we lost it in the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court. But every time it was an opportunity for organizing, getting people and being able to tell their stories and all that. And so even you would look at the first example I gave you is actually a winning litigation strategy, and the second was a losing litigation strategy, but actually the losing litigation strategy really helped people leverage power and give them opportunities to build their community. So I would say those two things would give us a couple of examples of what works, what doesn't.
That was so good. And a couple of things that kind of jumped out to me in terms of our international human rights work and corporate accountability work. A lot of folks looking at the participant list here have been involved in alien tort statute litigation or other kinds of big federal cases that go for years and years and years on behalf of communities that are very far away and have a difficult time being actively engaged in the litigation. And I think there is like a natural process through which even your plaintiffs, so not even the broader affected community, but just the plaintiffs in the case, can get really alienated from the process. So that sounded very familiar. So I think that's a phenomenon that just happens a lot in this kind of work, and being able to be intentional about it and address it is super important. So I'm glad you give that example. I also thought the idea of just as lawyers, it's so easy for us to get sucked into litigation as being the strategy. The win or the loss is what happens in the legal work, and it doesn't see the broader set of strategies that are being, engaged by this community, and seeing this as one thing that maybe is less important than a lot of the other strategies, and kind of remembering that as this is just one piece of something much bigger. So that I thought was really helpful also. Renee, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, and I think I'll just pick up on a couple of things that I think are kind of key to movement lawyering that Bill already mentioned. So one, I think, as you just said, like part of it is not just kind of deprogramming. There's a certain type of deprogramming that has to happen from law school, where a lot of times students that I encounter are socialized to think that the lawyer is the savior, or the lawyer is going to come in and figure out all the things and win the day. And that is just simply not effective, not the reality of the situation, not the reality of the law. We know that the law in large part causes harm. Sometimes the lawyer's role is only to do harm reduction. Sometimes we can think about more broader strategies, but generally, really, I think there's a certain type of deprogramming that has to happen. And moving away from this idea of experts being the people in the best position to identify and articulate what the problems are and priorities are, and then what potential solutions are. So, as Bill said, I think any good movement lawyering involves really building the power of communities and the communities that you're working with. And two, ensuring the agency of those communities and actually articulating the problem and articulating what the solutions are, right? And the values that go into actually trying to address those problems. And this is clear in different ways. I mean, I in part went to law school to do human rights work. I was very much interested in doing litigation around the alien tort statutes claims, and got very frustrated once I had opportunities to work in human rights, in the sense that, well, who's reading our reports? Well, okay, I'm documenting these cases that might be furthering certain social economic rights, but how does this actually translate to community? And it was pretty clear to me very quickly that you're only as effective as your efforts are in service to building power on the ground at the grassroots to actually allow people to materially change their conditions, right? And also that communities and individuals are in the best place to articulate their priorities and to identify their own problems. And so, as Bill, as said, in different ways, it's really about working with communities and listening and trying to provide different types of support that allows us sometimes to use legal tools and sometimes non-legal tools, and being flexible about that. So one of the examples that you mentioned, and a lot of what I try to do now, is really just help support people's visioning for themselves, right? And building their own types of institutions, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit. I have a lot of clients, for example, that are building businesses in part to, sustain themselves, to build out their livelihood, but also to address community issues. Or sometimes simply because they do not want to have to deal with the regulations that nonprofit 501c3 organizations are put under by the IRS, because there is, a whole history more or less of the IRS politically targeting certain types of progressive organizations and radical institutions. So a lot of what I do is really about institution building and helping people just kind of build out the types of institutions that they need and that actually work for them, whether it's, a space really just to activate and politicize people and build power or provide services, or to build out an entire business. And it comes along with different types of considerations. I myself try to be really thoughtful about my approach to lawyering, whether it's movement lawyering, but certainly being client-centered, thinking about rebellious lawyering in the sense that I'm building the capacity of my clients, and trying to not be a gatekeeper as the law often has us be, but to simply, pass along the information in terms of getting them in the best place to make decisions for themselves and to really act from a position of agency.
Great, thank you, Renee. So I have so many questions, and I would love to talk more about this power dynamics thing specifically, because I think it is so important, like how we're using our work to rebalance power. And as attorneys, I think our ethics rules so often say you represent this client and the specific needs of this client, that sometimes zooming out and seeing the bigger picture can be difficult. But I think maybe we can roll in some power analysis conversation into this next piece. I want to start talking about this international human rights lawyering problem that we have. So I see in my own work, and I'm just going to be very transparent about this, it is really hard sometimes to really feel like the work that we're doing is reflective of the communities that we purport to serve. I think that's difficult for a lot of reasons. And I'm looking at our list here of who's participating. I'm seeing people that are fighting against development finance projects, people who do Alien Tort Statute and Torture Victim Protection Act litigation, and of these other areas where we're litigating in US courts. The people that could benefit from our cases are sometimes spread all over the world in diverse communities that may or may not be well organized. They may not be in a position to speak with a collective voice because they don't have representatives. I would like to hear some really practical tips from you all to help us understand better how we can integrate some of these movement lawyering concepts and values into the way that we do our work. So maybe Bill, do you want to kick us off, and then we can pass to Renee?
So I'll start, but again, I want to be very clear that these are not tips on what to do. They are questions. Cutest dog in the world there, Renee, pulls the dog out just at the right time. She didn't pull the dog out while she was talking. That dog will steal the show. So in terms of the human right, as I said, my experience with this is I was at the Center for Constitutional Rights for a couple of years, and I've done a lot of work in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, and that was what the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. And what they had was a U.S. Law firm and a Haitian law firm. And those two firms worked in tandem. And the U.S. firm really subsidized a lot of the Haitian work. And the U.S. didn't do anything without clearing it with the Haitian people, and vice versa. And so I do not, again, I think it is this issue of lawyering for versus lawyering with. And I think it is particularly hard in international, but this is part of the whole challenge of international humanitarian work, economic justice, war, peace, refugees, everything is how do we do stuff with and not for? And part of that, you start with who is your partner? People should not be doing this kind of work without partners, and partners who are on the ground in the places that we think we are doing something good for. Because, plenty of us do that, I mean, and I include myself, because I mean, all of us over time, we do lots of things that we say, this is a really bad situation. Somebody ought to really do something about it. Maybe let's look at it and see what we can do. And then we do it. We search around for X number of months or years, and we figure out how to do something. And then we go ahead and we start to do it. But I think the respectful partnership means that there has to be one of the ideas that in human rights work that I know of is the idea of accompaniment, is that, we walk this path together. And so who are we walking the path with? Who is our partner? And I have in the chat is a couple of, I've made this little article, 10 questions for social change lawyers. So whose idea was it for you to do this work? Was it your idea that you came up with individually? Or was that something that somebody asked you to do? Or was it you had this idea, gee, there's this issue that we're developing some expertise on, and maybe we should look for partners around the world, somebody that, we can actually talk with, and we can have them come here, or we can go there, and we can really spend some time talking through this so that we are in a respectful partnership. We can't have a respectful partnership with people we don't know and people that we're not in a relationship with. So I think that, and that is very, very difficult. It's much more difficult than being a neighborhood partner or, an ideological partner and that sort of stuff. The other part of that is who gets the glory and who gets the money and who gets, the praise, and all those translate in who gets the power. And if it is lawyers in the United States who come up with an idea, very creative, they present it to foundations give them money, they do this stuff, they get PR going, they got the social thing going, and that, who is winning? I mean, who is profiting from this, and where is the power going? This is power that we build up for ourselves, for our organizations, for our causes. But think if we spent 50% of that creativity and energy and resources with a partner organization in another country or partner organizations. So part of this, I think the challenge is to dedicate the time, the energy, and the resources to partnership. Because without partnership, we are lawyering for and not with. And I know that is hard, and I'm not saying it's not very, very hard, but it is essential if we're really going to try to help people change the power relationships that they have in the communities that they're with. What kind of work are we actually doing? Are we computer lawyers? Or are we people lawyers? And so there is a tendency that we become computer lawyers. And that's just pulling it. That's what lawyers are these days, right? That's mostly what lawyers are. But if we're trying to change the world, if we're really dedicated to transforming the power relationships, not just at home, but around the world, then we have to do something else. And so I think we need to ask those questions of the social that I have listed out there. Are they the people on the margins? Are they people, the directly impacted people? What role are they playing? Whose advice are you taking? I'll start with that. I'll switch that back to Renee.
That's great. Thanks, Bill. Renee, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would probably just kind of emphasize some of the things that Bill has already laid out. It's, I think it's about being in deep relationship and also taking time to build those relationships. But, this piece about partnership to me also speaks to who evaluates your work. Like, who is it a board who is not at all connected to the problems perhaps that you say you're trying to address? Or is it the actual folks who are in community who ultimately you're saying your work is in service to, and trying to find real ways both for feedback and evaluation by the folks who are directly impacted, and be really thoughtful about that in terms of like their own time and capacity, and how do we compensate sometimes when we ask people for things that certainly is a gift to us more or less as organizations or as advocates. So I think part of it certainly is about the relationship piece. Part of it too is, for me, is also thinking about and being clear about when we're doing work that is more geared towards reform and when we're trying to also incorporate like the large horizon and really transformative work. And it's not to say that, there is a room for both strategies, but we have to take both into account and be clear about what we're doing and how we're doing the reform work in service to the transformation. So that's certainly a piece of it for me. And I do think it's really difficult, in terms of doing international work, depending on what that looks like. A lot of my work in human rights has been really human rights at home in the United States, and really thinking about how to use the framework and advocacy to further what people are already organizing for on the ground, and like the issues, like the real practical issues like clean water or like access to water, that folks are experiencing, and using the human rights framework to kind of further some of that. And then the other thing that I wanted to say is, I think that so much of this is really about having a practice of reflection. Because even if you come in, I think it's really clear just to set the principles by which you plan to operate first. But even if you have, those principles and our values aligned with the people that you're working with, and you're clear about those things, I think it's always really important to build in time to whatever kind of work you're doing to reflect, evaluate, make changes, because even, one of my experiences have been, even when we try to create spaces of progressive lawyering, of movement lawyering, I think it's always necessary to be honest and make space for critical reflection as we move forward, because even with the best of intentions, it doesn't always go the way you intend it to go. Or you recognize, for example, even in democratic practices, what the power dynamics still are in the room, and how do you actually get to some of that. So, I think so much of this is really about context, is really about relationships, as Bill said, and it's really about thinking, how do we shift power dynamics within communities so that, the folks on the ground who are the most impacted actually are enacting their vision for change, whatever that looks like.
Right. As you're talking, I'm thinking a lot about thinking about this more reformist versus transformational change, and like how those things differ. And often in the business and human rights or corporate accountability space, a lot of what we're doing is we're trying to get reparations for victims of corporate abuse, but we're kind of like too far down the process, right? So we need to go back up and stop the corporate abuse, instead of just constantly being in this mill where we're trying to get reparations for the widows of the banana workers or whatever it might be. And that's something that, I think that some of us in the movement are starting to think a lot more about how we can be more transformational. Another thing you sort of sparked in me is thinking more about how we run our own organizations and lives. Like, how are we bringing these practices of changing these power dynamics really into the various spaces in which we work, so that we're not just outcome focused, which I think is very standard in the capitalist economy. We want outcomes, but really look at the process and see, how do power dynamics work inside of our own organizations? How do we build communities of trust, and how do we prioritize relationship over winning? So I think that's also something that I was thinking about as you were talking. We're starting to get some questions in the Q&A, and I know that we're running short on time. I'm going to ask one more quick question, and then we can switch to the Q&A. One thing that I know, Bill, you've talked about a lot, but I'm also hearing this in what you're saying, Renee, is the role of hope and resilience. How can we, just as humans, engage this work in a way that's consistent with movement lawyering and is also sustainable? So I don't know, maybe Bill, if you want to start, tell us a little bit about your thoughts on hope.
So there's this great quote about hope that goes back 1,500 years. Sure, some of you know it. It says, hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and the courage to do something about it. And what I find is that I do not have hope when I am functioning as an issue lawyer, because the other side, and the corporate side and the capitalist side, I mean, those folks have so much power, and they, in the courts and in the various bodies that are supposed to hold them accountable, they have managed to pervert them. And so being an issue lawyer is very discouraging. When I am a person or community lawyer working on an issue, the issue can be quite an uphill issue. But by us becoming friends with and becoming in community with people who are struggling for these things, for the justice for their community, that I find that they are so inspiring, and they have such kindness and love and courage that they create hope and inspiration for me. And I can take the hope and inspiration from the people who are fighting, and hopefully occasionally I can provide some of that to them. But I mean, my experience is that more often I get it from them. And so that it is very important to have the hope that things can be different, because they can be different. And I would say the two parts of that in terms of hope, and that is love is very important. And love meaning absolutely real love, not some Hallmark love, but real love like we have for our kids, our families, and that sort of stuff. That is important, where we will sacrifice, but we also know others would sacrifice for us. Humility, especially as lawyers, nobody took a skills course or any other course on humility, right? We didn't get any of that. And we are being challenged in ways that we don't know the answers to. And so there's a sense that we just fall back on what we do know how to do. We do know how to do federal litigation, or so we will do that because that's what we do. Well, that may not be what's necessary. And then the last thing, I remember I went to a talk by some college students who had spent like 3 weeks in Nicaragua living. Each of them lived with a different family in a very rural setting. And they were from the suburbs of New Orleans, and they were like 20 years old, and they had these terrific insights from their weeks spent. And so I asked the question, I said, how do you go from the suburbs of New Orleans and working at and being a student at Loyola to spending 3 weeks in here and coming up to this? And the student who was about 19 or 20 thought for a second, said, well, first you have to be willing to be uncomfortable. And that is really the threshold thing for all of us, is a willingness to be uncomfortable and say, gee, I have to, as Renee said, I have to reflect critically on what I'm doing and what I want to do or what I think should be done, not as opposed to just what I'm good at or what I've found a way to do. Is, can I be uncomfortable? Am I willing to subject myself to be uncomfortable enough to maybe go spend some time in Port-au-Prince or time in wherever and listen to people and not know for sure what's going to happen, and being willing to accept that there'll be some failures in this stuff and some setbacks. And that, if you're doing that in partnership and in community with others who are fighting for this stuff, and you're not just reading the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and whatever, then you will find hope. Because right at that point where things are the worst, there are people right at the point of that sword who are living lives, building families, building community, struggling for survival, and they will teach you, as they've taught me, how to live and how to be energized by this and be able to overcome the challenges that we have.
Bill, I partially asked this question because I wanted you to say that quote.
Oh, good.
I haven't heard it from anyone but you, but you said this quote, and I always remember, and I always butcher it, but this quote about hope having these daughters, anger and courage. And I think about it because when we were going in to get sentenced, it was like we'd all gotten arrested. We're going in to get sentenced, and you said this quote to us, and it impacted me so much. And it honestly gave me so much hope. And it gave order to what felt like a really complicated and complex moment where we were just going to walk in and the state was going to tell us how long we had to spend in prison, and it was overwhelming. And that was just a really kind of beautiful sentiment to share with us in that moment. So I was hoping that would happen. Renee, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Yeah, so just I guess a couple of things. One of the things I think, actually, let me start with a quote. I mean, one of the things that I think in terms of that I tell my students a lot of times is that, and I'm not sure exactly if this comes from a particular place, but most lawyers say no and good lawyers say how. And what I mean by that is that, I think a lot of times what we think our job is as lawyers is to explain the disappointments of the law to our clients, right? Or the shortcomings of the legal system. And what we do when we take that approach is like we fail to imagine beyond what currently exists in the law. And so a lot of my hope and I think encouragement is really being able to practice and work with clients that live in a space where they are reimagining what's possible. And what that requires me to do as an attorney working with them is to also imagine beyond what currently exists in the law. And so, certainly, as Bill said, my experience as well in working in movement or working with organizations, I have learned certainly more from many of my clients, more from organizers than I had ever learned in law school, certainly. Some of my clients, some of the organizers I've had the opportunity just to be in space with is the most brilliant people that I've ever met. And so, I think in doing this work, it also provides us with a space to constantly be encouraged, because I'm not under any illusion that people aren't actively working to organize and address issues in their communities every single day, and at least get to be a part or see and experience and observe some of that work that's already happening. And I think the thing is, where I'm most encouraged is the ways in which people are thinking about institution building and thinking about building the institutions that they need in different ways. And really what I think that's about, to further, right, kind of the embodiment of human rights, is really getting to a place where we have permanently organized communities, where folks actually have the direct control over institutions that actually provide the things that they need to thrive, to live, like to be in relationship with each other in the ways that they want. And so I think that's where I draw a lot of my encouragement from, and kind of want to live in that space, as a lawyer, as someone who's involved in different ways in movement.
Great. I wish this had been scheduled as a 90-minute webinar, because I have so many more questions. We've got a couple great questions in the Q&A. So how about I read them out, and then you two can choose who goes first and just maybe address whatever pieces of these you want to. So our first question is from Huda, who is actually one of our interns, and I think is also a client of Renee's, or Blue 10 is one of your. So Huda Katebi, she's amazing. So for all three of us on the panel, she asks, what is the balance of trying cases you're going to lose, but is important for the political implications or the conversation that it will spark? How do you decide when and when not to try those cases? Very interesting question. Renee says, shout out to Blue 10. And then we have another question that says, what are examples of effective ways that lawyers in the US can support lawyers and legal advocates in other countries, so that the local legal system can better counter US corporate abuses? What are some pitfalls in these attempts? So I'll shoot it to either one of you who wants to go first.
Yeah, Bill, you want to take the HOTUS question first?
No, I want you to.
Well, listen, I stopped trying cases because I got frustrated. So, but that's not to say, I think in my experience, like in working on larger campaigns when litigation is a part of the strategy, is really being intentional about how it's a part of the strategy. As I think Bill gave a really wonderful example about maybe a case that you intend to lose, but being intentional about the ways in which it's going to further the overall campaign and building that into the strategy overall, right? And so I think that a lot of times, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I could give an example of a case here that was really meant to get at some of the inequality that is in the power dynamics, for example, of economic development in the city of Chicago, that didn't really go very far, but also raised awareness and was used as a tool to activate people around the ways in which public funds are transferred into private hands, right, for their benefit. So I think, to the extent that it can play a meaningful role in the larger strategy, the case a lot of times is worth taking on assuming that you have both the resources and, you know, the capacity to be able to do that, but being clear about using it as one part of a larger strategy or leveraging it, you know, in an intentional way on the back end in terms of moving forward with it.
Yeah, and I just think in terms of litigation, we have to be so skeptical of using it because of, you know, the courts are just getting worse and worse and worse, and you know, it's getting more and more and more expensive. Takes more and more hours as the barriers to participation, you know, in the law itself, and that just take, you know, just massive amounts of work. So realizing that, you know, even if you are a public interest social justice litigator, chances are you're going to lose, right? So whether you have a community with you or not. So if in fact you have a 50% chance of losing, then how can you take that litigation? How can that litigation be a partner and accompany other actions for a community to empower a group and stuff like that to be able to do something? So planning on how you make the litigation be valuable, even if you're going to lose, is part of what everybody should do. In terms of examples, I gave the one. Yeah, I am.
Okay, got some people coming in.
Okay, great. I could bring all them in here, but they our prisons are, you know, a different country altogether within our own country. But the other thing that I would say in terms of an example, when I was with CCR and since, is that partnering with LGBTQ in groups in Uganda, where United States missionaries and other people had helped energize the anti-LGBTQ community to make it, you know, more criminal consequences in that. And as a consequence of some things in the United States, some things in international courts, some things in accompaniment, and that where actually the LGBT community in that country was fortified, was given opportunities to do more. These are all opportunities they created for themselves, but by participation with US partners, again, physical participation, that are actually there to provide protection and other things like that, that there are a lot of things that can be done. So there are stories out there. And I think if you're interested in it, that ought to be part of it, because educating ourselves about how social change comes about and what a success looks like is part of what we have to do in terms of, like Renee says, in terms of reimagining what we're trying to do.
Great, thanks, Bill. And maybe if I'll jump in with a couple of answers too to these questions, since one of them was also directed to me. You know, to Huda's question, we sort of did this recently, that I have to talk about it in generalities. We do a lot kind of behind the scenes. We were working with a community outside of the United States that had a problem that related to a US company in an agricultural industry. We worked with a local law firm that filed a case against them, not because we thought against the company, the US-based agricultural company, not because we thought it was a winner, but because the community thought that it would be helpful for their local campaign in the country where they're based. And the company wound up getting kicked out of a certifying organization, which, you know, doesn't resolve all of the problems, but it does help them a little bit with their public campaigning. So we have found it worth it sometimes to do cases that we kind of knew legally were losers because the community wanted to and thought it might be valuable. So I think there's space for that. It just varies, but it's also kind of expensive. So it's a real, sometimes it's a tough call. And then on the second question about examples of effective ways that lawyers in the US can support lawyers and legal advocates in other countries, you know, this is something that I know there's a lot of organizations that do all kinds of trainings and things. Sometimes those can be effective, and I think maybe in a lot of cases they are effective. I know Earthrights does some really interesting work there. I know some of you are on this. We're right now working with a group of Colombian civil litigators to see if they can start bringing cases in Colombia for human rights abuses. It's a slow, difficult process. It's not a training. They're training us as much as we're training them. It's like a conversation between civil litigators and human rights attorneys who don't do any civil litigation at all, to see if they can kind of bridge that gap. So I think it's like experimental. It's really patchwork. You can't do it at some sort of high level systemic way. It's just sort of country by country, legal system by legal system, but there is a lot of action in that space. Can
I invite 20
yes.
people into this thing? So
I think you should.
people
I think this is a good way a good send off. So all of the folks that I think were involved in this campaign to regain rights that just won.
We're gonna make a train.
Great. Hi. Awesome. This is a really good way to end out this panel, celebrating a victory.
So these are some of the folks that are just celebrating the victory today. And so these are 50 lawyers from around the country that are trying to figure out how to do working with organizations in the United States and across the world. So
Thank you guys. Thank you guys.
Congratulations to you all. Great work.
Thank you.
Really happy for you.
We fight, we win.
So with that, I think we should close out our panel because we're a little over time. I want to give a big thank you to Bill Quigley, an amazing person in the space. Renee Hasher, I'm just so excited. You had so many inspirational words. It's so helpful. Love the work that you're doing here locally in Chicago. We need to connect more. This has been a great panel. I also want to give a shout out to Renee's dog, who really brought the cuteness. It was a wonderful addition to this panel. So thank you so much. We're getting a lot of great comments about how good this panel was. So appreciative. Thank you both.
Great. This is great. I'm really excited. And I think we need to continue these types of conversations to break down silos within human rights practice, because ultimately I think we're coming at the same problems from different perspectives, and trying to leverage it all together, I think, is more effective.
yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, Renee, your dog can zoom in anytime. Thanks, everybody. Take care.